Hello and welcome to this panel discussion, Connecting Leadership and Operations to Bring Transformation. How can they be more aligned? With me for the next hour and with you for the next hour are three esteemed panelists. First, we have on the top left of my screen, Basit Riaz, Head of UK Due Diligence of BNP Paribas. Basit joined BNP in 2011. He's currently heading up their KYC due diligence team with both new client onboarding and periodic refresh. Basit has over 20 years experience in several international banks and held client relationship management roles, operations and AML. We're also joined by Tim Tyler, Head of Qualifications at the International Compliance Association. Tim joined the ICA from the Gambling Commission, where he was responsible for all aspects of AML regulation supervision. And prior to that, has 30 years experience in UK law enforcement, spanning roles at the Serious Organised Crime Agency and the National Crime Agency. And during those roles include oversight and interaction at UK's Interpol and Europol Central Intelligence Bureaus, and working on complex fraud investigations with the Serious Fraud Office. And finally, Bill Houseman. Bill Houseman is a Senior Director here of a Compliance Solutions business. Bill brings 25 years experience designing and deploying global compliance and ethics programs. And my name's Ted Datter, and I lead our compliance practice for Europe and Africa. So welcome to you all, and welcome to you for joining. Thank you for staying with us. A couple of housekeeping points. We are having live Q&A throughout, so please do feel free to submit questions, and I'll be receiving those, and I can pass those to our panelists through the session. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And we're also doing 2 live poll questions. So keep ready for those as they come. I'll be pushing those polls live during each of our segments, and we'll be just discussing and reacting to those responses as they come through. The topic we'll take in 3, so we have a big area for discussion, lots to get into. We'll break it down into 3 parts. First, we'll think about quite practically that operations and leadership, that relationship, and need to work together to try to bring transformation. We'll hear from Basit initially on his experiences and his story. We'll then think a little bit more broadly and a little bit more conceptually around the differences between management on one hand and leadership in the other. And Tim will lead us through his thoughts and help us unpack that topic and think about the skill development that we might feel in the future. And then we'll think, again, without getting too existential, at the end of the panel, what could we do differently? Things we've learned, we've got a huge amount of experience here. So thinking about how good funding programs have worked, how understanding appetite of risk from the board, and lessons learned that we'll share, things that we could do differently and things we can learn from in the future. So very much an open set of topics to discuss. So moving through, let's get going. In the first section, before we get into that, the first topic is around, as I mentioned, leadership, operations, the connection between those two, and how alignment works best. We're going to push a poll. So if I could ask to launch a poll, just for those of you that are here with us live. The question we want to ask you, and it may change, so do feel free to think about this over the next 10 or so minutes, but to what extent do you think your leadership and operations teams are currently aligned? And you can see 4 options there. So you can see in front of you, very aligned down to you're not sure, and not aligned at all. So whilst those our audience participants familiarise with that and interact with the poll, we'll give them some time. Basit, if I could come to you and perhaps just to begin and set the scene, maybe a little bit about your background, experiences at the bank. And I know that you're on and have been on a large transformation journey there for a number of years. So maybe you could set the scene for us a little bit and help us think about your experiences and the connections between operations and leadership.
Thank you so much. So, pleasure to be here. And first of all, a big congratulations to BVD. I think today's this event, it's so far very successful. Have have attended couple of sessions. So a big congratulations to BVD, and thank you so much for giving, I think, the opportunity to a lot of the audience to learn from quite skilled people. I started my banking journey around year 2000. So have been fortunate enough to work in quite a few top tier banks here in the UK. And it's really, I think the journey first started very much from a very small branch, working in a very small bank where one can have the exposure to various different things rather than just going into a one big department and just piece of, sort of a big department, a small piece there. Had the opportunity to work in a smaller bank where the exposure was that could learn very various different things that goes around around the banking systems, and then progressed from ops to client management, client relationship, and then slowly journey went from client relationship management to AML, sanctions, and have done now in the last 4 or 5 years, been managing in the UK the KYC team, which looks after all the client onboarding and client recertification. So in that sort of background, very in a way very unique background, where I had the opportunity to work in small organization, learn different operational topics, then move on to slightly bigger banks, learn the client relationship management, the client needs, the client services demands, etc. Then moving on to the AML side, then moving on to the sanction side, and finally taking the more like a leadership position to make sure that the bank here in the UK, it's know your client and customer due diligence processes, policies, everything is very much aligned with the bank's expectations and the UK regulatory expectations. So that's sort of the overall background.
Yeah, and we spoke. Thank you for that. We spoke in the sort of pre-discussions around the transformational projects, or the transformation that the bank's been on broadly, the changes. Could you kind of summarize from where you've seen? Clearly, you've got a very unique position because you've got that 360 view, if you like, having come through operations and now interacting more in the regulatory compliance world. But yeah, anything you could share on just the kind of high level last 2 or 3 years, what that's meant for your teams, and some of the good that you've seen out of that in terms of the understanding around the challenges on the shop floor and how that managing up piece has worked for you, and that might be interesting for our audience to think about, and that will help us with the next couple of topics, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So the BNP Paribas a few years ago changed their motto to Bank for Changing World. So this is the caption for BNP Paribas. And I think like any other major financial institutions, a global financial institution, a lot is happening. Regulators are getting quite aggressive. Also parliaments and different laws, new things are coming almost in every single country. Client demands are, of course, client expectations are more from the big financial institutions. So when you put all this together, I think this is a challenge for any global bank, is that after every period of every 5 to 10 years, they have to go through a transformation. And transformation meaning that transformation in the systems, then change, which means that the way they operate, and obviously new system would require them to change the way they operate on day-to-day basis. Then ever changing regulatory policies. How do you make sure that your systems are agile enough, the tools that you are using are agile enough, that any new regulations coming in, you can actually plug in to your systems very quickly. Also your processes are quite fluid, that the value chain is very clear, and it's broken down so clearly that who is doing what in the value chain, end-to-end value chain in the ops, so that you can very quickly pinpoint that when regulatory change comes in, which area of the process or the teams or the country you need to go and to change. And then to also complement that, the global banks, as you know, like BNP Paribas or any other top tier banks, the clients are often now require multi jurisdiction know your client KYC flags, and this is also I think the aspiration of most of the banks that if you open a bank account in a small branch in BNP, for example, in a small country or any other large multinational organization, the expectation of the bank is that you maximize your revenue, and the client is then introduced to many other jurisdictions. So how do you make sure that your transformation and the change you are bringing in, it is not focused on just one little country. It is focused on a global perspective, so that when you are introducing your client from one country to another country, you have a process in place that the ops, it's not the work is not duplicated, so you're not keep on repeating your work, so you do it right at the first time. So that's just the broader picture. But in terms of the transformation in the last few years, in particular since the 2014, when the BNP Paribas had an unfortunate situation in the US, and quite a big heavy fine it received due to some sanctions issues from the US regulators. I think that was the turning point. Any other financial institutions, after paying that huge big fine, could have gone into any direction. But I think that was the pivotal moment for the bank, and that is when the transformation and the change culture was introduced more broadly in the bank. And what we have seen in the last in particular in the last 5 years, that changing the tools, rather than focusing on one particular tool and one particular system, try to look for a system that provide more holistic view, and then where the whole picture, whole client life cycle can be stored, as opposed to small little systems like an old plane, and then you keep on fixing different things. It is to have a system that is holistic, that basically address the full client life cycle in terms of the ops, when it comes to due diligence, the client activities, what sort of different type of products a particular client is doing. And so I think in the last few years, what we have gone through and the personal journey is that when it comes to implementing the changes and transformation, any huge big project, you gotta have to have the involvement from the top to the very bottom clerk level. It cannot really be implemented if it is only done in some meeting rooms and in some presentations. You really have to be involved and get the people from top to bottom involved. And also the robotics, when it comes in, the other thing that is that it is something that is quite sensitive. What we have noticed, personally what I've noticed, is that the moment you like to introduce any more digitalized type of transformation or more robotics, the first thing comes to people's mind is, am I going to lose my job? And then the moment you send that type of message in the transformation, in a change program, that somehow the objective is to save the money, to save it's a cost driven project, it could send a very very bad signal. And then few other things as well, which hopefully we'll discuss during the course of the panel.
Thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack in there. You've given us a lot of problem statements and things, and I think you've talked a little bit about solutions, which is good, around how you solve something locally and globally, and how do you have, I guess, minimum standards that can encourage customer adoption and not and promote financial inclusion ultimately, but also having something which is holistic. And you mentioned, of course, that solutions and systems are integral to achieving that. I'm going to bring Bill, just your thoughts on this before we turn, maybe thinking about the leadership dimension with management. And clearly this transformational journey required what it sounds like true leadership to bring operations along. But in terms of solutions, one of the key problems that Bassett talked to, or kind of one of the reasons they've been able to unlock this at the bank, is that having something that's right sized for something local and small but scalable in terms of technology and data to help move from regional and fragmentation to something global. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about your experiences of how that's worked in some of the implementations, or even alternatively where you've seen people struggle with that.
So, and Bassett, that's transformation, and a lot of those issues that you've talked about, we see often, more often than I'd like. But the reality is that more corporations and banks are feeling that in order to combat financial crime, they've got to be transformative. I think the biggest first mistake is that we don't see the upskilling of both management and leadership or operations in alignment. And frankly, it's management and leadership which needs more upskilling for the current environments that would lead to a true transformation of process and a reduction in risk. So it's that ability to really understand the risks and then apply new learnings at both levels. That's where I've seen it works the best, because then there's an understanding of what's too much technology, what's too little technology, and both groups understand that. Because what's happened is that generally the operations team is saying, oh, I could do this much better if I had X, Y, and Z data or X, Y, and Z technology. That's not enough. They also have to be able to appreciate exactly how that's going to be applied, and does it align with the risk appetite of leadership. So it seems to be a classic, I was ready, I executed, and then I aimed. That seems to be a lot of where the problems start. And I just think that it needs that thoughtfulness at the beginning of how to bring people, data, and technology together to solve exactly what Bassett was talking about in terms of global problems around financial crime.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, isn't there? And certainly, I think it's probably a point where we would just firstly, I'd like to bring the poll results back, and before I come to bring Tim in on the topic which you've alluded to there on leadership management, could we return the polls? Okay, cool. We can see those. So most people are hedging their bets and saying that they're somewhat aligned. It's quite interesting that I think not aligned at all and very aligned is probably an even number of votes. So you might think you probably want to have slightly more in alignment, but I think that really gets to the crux of this challenge. To bring that forward, any comment, Bassett? Would you think that?
So I think this is a great result, and you see, in my opinion, that one has to define who is a leader. Often I think is the case that we expect that the managing directors or the COOs of the bank and the CFOs and etc. The head of the departments, everything is down to them. They are the leaders. They have to be aligned with everyone. Whilst in reality, I think we are all leaders. If, in my opinion, anyone who is managing who is managing anyone is a leader. And even actually, you're not managing anyone. You have your kids. You are a leader at home. So one way or shape, you are a leader. So I think the expectation is, what is the expectation first of all? That do you expect that I should be meeting the CEO of the bank every day? In my current role, I have the exposure to the head of territory, twice a month. I meet some other head of the business lines at least on weekly basis. But then there are managers who report to me. They perhaps have this opportunity maybe once every 6 months. Then there are people down below. They have even less. So I think it's first of all having your expectation that who do you see the leader? I see the leader to the guy who is above me. And it's the value chain. So if the answer is if someone who is answered here, for example, they're not sure, then that is does that mean that they are not sure because there is a misalignment between a a ops worker, and then they feel that the MD or the head of the bank is not aligned to what that person's day-to-day problem is, or is that person's answer reflect that the direct line manager, the people, like if I am here, if someone is saying to me that Basit, I feel that you are not aligned even with me, that's a very big problem in my opinion, because then your immediate person is saying I'm not aligned. But if I'm saying that I'm not aligned with my COO, that potentially could be a communication gap. The COO or the MD's communication is not impactful, and this is where perhaps the problem is, because my personal experience in many banks is that generally the senior management, they are very aligned with ops. In particular, in the last 5 or 6 years, since in the UK the senior manager regime has come in, whereby the senior managers are personally liable, responsible for making sure that all the risks control framework, everything is managed properly. They are very much involved, but it is just that potentially it could be possible that everyone in the bank is not aware. So I think it's a very interesting question, and the answers, it really depends on the perspective of the answer. But if the perspective of the answer, and if the answer is, as I said, that if someone feels that their direct line manager is not aligned, in my opinion, that is a huge big problem in that particular firm. But if I am saying that I'm not aligned with a head of territory and I only see that person every 6 months, then there is potentially, as I said, there is a gap of some communication.
Makes sense. Tim, I can see you nodding at points during that. I'd like to come to you at this point. Bassett made a really interesting observation there about leadership really being, I guess, more of a mindset than anything else. Perhaps you could help us unpack this relationship or these different terms, management and leadership, and help frame that for us.
I'm delighted to, Ted. And can I say thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon. So there's been a lot of talk already about the importance of leadership. Bassett's talked about aggressive regulators, transformation programs. Change is a constant in the professional lives for many of us. And I think it might be useful to consider the role of leadership in that context. And to do that, what I'd like to do is look at one particular model. Now, there are many models, and I'm sure that those people that are taking part this afternoon will be familiar with perhaps dozens of different models around leadership and the qualities, of course, that we can identify with leadership. I'm going to approach this through just one to keep it simple, but it's one that I think sheds light on our current approach to compliance, financial crime prevention, anti-money laundering. And it does this at a global, a national, but also at an organizational level. I guess you'll make your own minds up, but let me share with you this model. It's derived by a professor called Keith Grint. I was fortunate to spend some time training with him about 10 years ago, and it's resonated in my experience and my work through a range of different transformation programs since that time. And what Keith Grint talks about is the nature of leadership, but rather than looking at it in the context of the qualities of a leader, he looks at it through the prism of the challenges facing a leader and the way in which they engage them. And in particular, he talks about critical, tame, and wicked problems. Now, bear with me on this. I hope it makes sense. So critical problems are challenges that we face fairly regularly that are immediate and urgent. So for example, we come into the office on a Monday morning and the IT system has collapsed. Now that is almost an existential threat. That is critical. It requires urgent attention. This is not the time to call a committee meeting, to set terms of reference, to determine a strategic approach. This is a time for decision-making, for direction. And so the style of leadership, of course, I feel like I'm stating the obvious. The style of leadership is command, direct, and show confidence in the outcome. The second type of challenge I mentioned, of course, is the tame problem. Now, he calls it the tame problem because it is one that has been tamed. So it's one that is understood, that we've encountered previously. We have tried and tested formulas to resolve it. We have processes, and it's the role of a manager to apply resources, to apply processes, in the confidence that as they do that, it will resolve that particular challenge or problem. So the solution to a tame problem is described as elegant. It's elegant because you can predict the outcome. It's structured, it's logical, it's intuitive. So this is the second type of problem, and it takes us to the third, which we call wicked. And these are challenges that we haven't encountered before, or if we have encountered them, we haven't quite got to grips with them. We haven't solved them yet. So a good example might be the COVID crisis. Much of politics is about dealing with uncertain, wicked problems. Now, this is the role of leadership. It requires courage and innovation. It requires us to develop solutions that are outside of normal thinking. And the type of solution isn't elegant. It's not predictable, controlled. We would describe it as clumsy. So it needs trial and error. It needs collaboration. The solutions are complex. They might be layered. There is risk around applying this. It might not work. But it is here that we find solutions to wicked problems. And in terms of the qualities of a leader, well, it's not difficult to identify, but we think of vision, courage to make those hard judgments, empathy to build strategic alliances and collaboration, integrity to know when something isn't working, to have the courage to move away from it, to do something different, but also a little bit of street wisdom, a little bit of political savvy to manipulate the situation and manage the tension and the uncertainty that the solutions you're developing will inevitably bring. So these are clumsy solutions. So that's the theory, very, very, very briefly. Now, if we focus for a moment on the global approach to anti-money laundering, this, of course, has been very much in the news. It's been very much, I think, in our minds in terms of leadership within compliance and anti-money laundering. Our sense is that it isn't as successful as it might be. There is, I think, fairly strong evidence when you look at the recidivist offenders who keep on making the same mistakes, when you look at the level of asset recovery or the level of money laundering prosecutions or the way in which organized crime continues to go and increase across so many areas. There's strong evidence that it's not as successful as it might be. Now, of course, the focus isn't on that this afternoon, but it's interesting. And the reason I mention it is because very often we see the solution in terms of processes and policy. So at a global level, 40 FATF recommendations. That emphasis on standards, on consistency. We see routinely big fines being issued. And that, of course, generates a risk-averse context and response at board level. I wonder whether that is the best environment to find solutions to what I would suggest is a wicked problem. So almost finished, but if you can just bear with me for a moment, just to finish this off, Greg Bayer, who's the a president of the Clearinghouse Association in the United States gave evidence to the House of Representatives Financial Services Subcommittee. And he said that misdirected, and I'm quoting, misdirected systems focus on what can be controlled and counted, policies, procedures, and quantifiable metrics, such as the number of alerts, the number of suspicious activity reports. And his inference was that in doing that, we are looking in the wrong place. We're trying to find solutions that we can control rather than looking to innovate. So I'm not suggesting that the 40 recommendations aren't important. Of course they are. They provide a vital framework. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have policies or regulatory imperatives or management information. But I think what I'm challenging is that kind of thinking that sees the answer there, removing the possibility of risk, trial and error, collaboration. Well, if we apply Keith Grint's model, I wonder whether we are, well, barking up the wrong tree. Perhaps something a little bit controversial here, but Ted, we talked about this beforehand, and I think you were sort of encouraging maybe a slightly alternative perspective to this.
Thank you for that, Tim. Agreed, yes. I think you've set the scene for the next 25 minutes of discussion for sure. While we think about that, I'd like to just launch the second poll, which you may have been heavily influenced by the last 10 minutes when think about it, but it's hopefully in front of you now for those who are with us. And the question in front of you is a fairly binary one. So do you think your leadership team is fully educated on the role and importance of the compliance function? Within the context of that, of course, thinking about that insight in the leadership team might have in terms of solving current problems using existing ways of thinking, which itself I think is another point for discussion, and perhaps one of the, as Tim's alluded to, one of the big fallacies that we can solve wicked problems with existing ways of thinking, existing ways of applying systems and processes. But that aside, be good to get the thoughts of the audience as we unpack a bit of what we've heard there from Tim. Bill, if I could bring you in there, you know, you've got a lot of experience of, again, perhaps failures and perhaps successes when thinking about solving challenging problems with existing ways of doing. How have you seen in the last 2 or 3 years innovation respond to that? I mean, there's enormous amounts of new technology. We know technology is not a panacea, of course, and in fact, in some cases, it creates an amplification effect where things are made worse through things like artificial intelligence. But perhaps what you're seeing is kind of, I'm going to say strands of hope, but some areas that you might want to draw on as areas that can perhaps offer some solutions, at least some of the most complex areas that Tim has talked through.
Yeah, it's Tim, that was great, and particularly the wicked and the assumption that it takes a different approach. And I guess that's the good and the bad, because that's discouraging because many organizations don't want to take a different approach, either for financial reasons or just because they just don't have the will. It's not important enough. Revenue is much more important than human greed. But it is the hope that I see is that technology is allowing, you know, as Bassett was talking about, all of those processes, technology is allowing multiple processes that were always siloed to be linked. And that's the magic of the new technologies, is that if I can truly understand the relationship with a client or a supplier or a distributor, whoever, if I can really understand that and map it every day so that I see the movement of that relationship and the risks associated with it. That was always okay, that's done Friday, I'll know whether or not somebody's sanctioned, and then maybe 3 weeks from now, I'll know whether or not they're a human trafficker. And what the technologies, and it's technology and data, then feeding people who are the decision makers. They're the ones, they're the gatekeepers, but they have to spend seconds making a decision versus the old way, the non-transformative way, which was hours or days or weeks making a decision. So the new technologies, if you really put it together, whatever act that is creating profits can also be looked at in terms of the risks and evaluated simultaneously. So a loan, for instance, if I give a loan to a criminal network, I'm going to get paid back with dirty money. Criminal proceeds are going to pay that back. If I knew it was a criminal network, would I not stop? Yes, I would. I don't, unless you're the one person who's the plant inside. But the point is that if we can truly connect those actions, the positive, which is the profit-making activity, and the risk detection, which is really to human good, it's reducing money laundering. If you can make that one activity, that's what the new technologies and data are doing. Now, that requires transformation of mindsets. And where I've seen it work is where literally the situation is the operational team is spent. They're exhausted. They can't do any more. And yet the chief compliance officer, chief risk officer, the audit committee on the board, they're dissatisfied with what's being done. That is the perfect recipe for movement and traction and transformation because, and we'll talk a little bit about ROI later, but you've got to get spend, but that spend has to have legitimate, profit-driven, and risk detection-driven ROI. If you can get those two, and I believe the new technologies are making it such that all this is coming together, and I'm not saying every organization is there, actually not many are fully there, but there is a path now. But it is all about speed to that decision, both the profit side as well as the risk detection side.
Thank you, Bill. I want to bring Tim back in a little bit, and I'll come back to Bassett on sort of practical experiences. But Tim, you've talked previously in sessions that I've been on around this transformation of rules-based to behavioural in regards to the underpinning environment that people work in, whether it's the technology, and as Bill talked to, the data that can help inform thinking and models. Clearly, like I say, come back to the point, technology itself is not a panacea, but for things like artificial intelligence, where would you put that on the kind of map? Don't want to be too simplistic, but around things like solving wicked problems, new schools of thinking. How much hope and how much store should we put ultimately in what's emerging in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of capabilities of information and technology to help?
So there was one thing or a couple of things that Bill mentioned that stood out for me. So Bill touched on the utility of identifying that you're onboarding a human trafficker only weeks or months after they have already been onboarded. And there's a sense in which that's almost too late. And yet the data is very often there. It's available at the point of onboarding. So if technology can better enable us to understand, to interpret what is complex data coming from multiple different sources, so social media, geolocation, the internet, activity, pricing, peer activity, and so it continues. There's vast amounts of data. What we don't have, of course, is the processing ability to really understand it and evaluate it properly, because it will, as Bill mentioned, drive good decisions. So in that context, I absolutely agree. Can I say one more thing, though? And that is that the technology isn't the solution in isolation. I don't think Bill was suggesting that. It's not a silver bullet in isolation. It works, it's effective, but when that's set into the context of a range of other factors. So we've been talking about some this afternoon, but other factors such as clarity on direction and strategic approach, clarity on what we want from the technology and how that aligns to our planned operational activity. Clarity so that we don't simply reproduce current processes, but redesign them so that they are appropriate to the goals that we want from the technology. And other context for this, of course, is other developments, such as building a more collaborative approach, subject to data protection restrictions, sharing information, working with other banks. Section 314 of the Patriot Act, of course, permits this in the United States. We have means to share information elsewhere around the world, including here in the UK. It's, we know, very, very effective. So if technology is used in the context of a number of other measures, then it becomes powerful. And if I can just say one more thing, I feel I've talked enough, but one more thing. We were talking about human trafficking. And for me, I think that's a really powerful example. Powerful because we know the extent of suffering that it causes. You know, the estimates are something like 24 million people, according to FATF. Other organizations put it at more like 40 million people. It leads to forced prostitution. It leads to organ harvesting. This is a very real and appalling threat that's happening around us. So anything that we can do to make a difference is powerful. But it's also, I think, a good example because you do see Standard Chartered Bank, for instance, has been quite innovative in its approach around human trafficking. It has taken a much more proactive approach, in part enabled through new technologies, but in part also because of a slight change in strategic direction, looking at human trafficking to understand it, and then applying that understanding to its own data, its own systems, and the many, many markets across which it is operating. That enables the bank to be much more on the front foot, which I think was what Bill was talking about just moments ago.
Thank you, Tim. I want to just pan back to Basit on one of the points you mentioned, which is this continual feedback learning, if you like, between operations as the owners of the process, managers and leadership, or management as the recipient, if you like, the customer, and that need to continually improve the process and the teachings that need to go in, either in terms of the type of skill sets, but maybe specifically about the technology and deploying that. It's probably an ongoing day-to-day part of your life, I suspect, Basit, but are there any experiences you could share around that in terms of programs that you've been through, projects, or just the sort of general, how that filters into daily, needing to deliver things to management, but also being able to influence the outcome through continually changing and enhancing and that continuous improvement of the process itself?
Absolutely. So I think, like the BNP Paribas, any global banks, the offerings that they are giving to the clients, it's now gone at such a huge big level where clients are coming and trading directly with the bank. Clients who are using direct market access where the bank is helping them. So you are almost sponsoring a client to go and trade on your behalf using your bank's credentials and balance sheet and access, and you are giving them direct market access to the world commodity exchanges, trading stock exchanges. The trading mechanism is gone so at a different level that it's not the old days where the client pick up the phone, he knows you, he's saying, hey Ted, this is Basit, need to do this, this Basit always does this type of trades, he's not a dodgy guy. So those old school dealing. I've been a private banker, the client, the client's wife, the clients, how many kids they have, how many wives they had before, this, that. You have read their wills, you have read all their wealth planning, so the whole, everything about the client. Now it's so digitalized that you don't speak to the client, you have given them automated trading access. They are trading night, day, 24 hours. So I think the situation now is that, and to bring the context back to the discussion that I think Tim, summed it up very well. The issue is that the financial security, national security is so interlinked now that it is almost that the banks now are at the forefront to making sure that not only that they are protecting themselves from the, from the regulators, the fines and things. That's just, in my opinion, secondary. They also have an important part to play now to make sure that the national security of the country is also, in a way protected, so that all these organized criminals and other financial criminals are not able to use the organization or the financial institution. But what we have noticed is that in order to make sure that, as I was alluding to before, having systems where the entire holistic data of a client is easily accessible, and having attributes where the nitty gritty about the clients is collected and you are able to understand that what type of different activity this client was supposed to be doing with us when we onboarded. And there has to be a periodic review to see whether the anticipated activity that when you onboarded the client is in line with the actual activity that they are doing. And then that is based on the risk of the client. Would you like to do it in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year? It really depends on the risk appetite. So the, the in order to make sure that the data, first of all, the data is captured in a way that it is not something that you would have to have so many different systems to go and find out what really is this client is doing with the bank and how they are operating. And secondly, that once you have collected this data, is to do a comparison to exactly, as I said, that what they were supposed to be doing. And this is where it is it requires a qualitative assessment and not just a tick box approach. I've worked in banks where too much reliance is placed on a tick box approach. They have checklists, operational teams are given checklists, so they just follow the checklist. And as our Tim was mentioning before, so a human trafficker, for example, a company that has been onboarded and you've already done 5-10 transactions with them, and then there is a SAR because there is some transaction monitoring system that has alerted you or somebody else has then informed the organization. But then during the process, it will tell you that these organized criminals, they are so sophisticated that when it comes to the documentation, they will provide you the right documentation. So, collecting the data, making sure that the approach is not a tick box checklist approach, and the approach is something that you can have guys who are collecting just the documents and the data and uploading in your various repositories and tools and systems. But there has to be a degree of quality control checks by someone who is a subject matter expert, understanding the product risks, understanding whether that particular product is also in line with the client's activities, client's profile. Suitability and etc. is always done by the front office. I am more specifically, trying to say in terms of the compliance risks. So the product risk related to compliance, not in terms of the MiFID and other suitability. So having a good quality control in place and having a structure or a framework where the team or the people who are undertaking the quality control are very much sitting on the side and they are not put under the spotlight or with direct contacts with the clients, with the front office, very much a team that is almost an independent second line of defense within the ops that is required to undertake a quality control that could save you millions or billions in terms of, like if you take the example of BNP Paribas, the fine was, in excess of, $9 billion. That could save you millions and billions if you can spend a little amount of money and make sure that there is a quality control framework that is independent from the overall process, and those people are not given any production related targets or any direct contact with so many people, and there is very much a second line of defense sitting within the ops team that is ensuring that the not only that the box have been ticked and all the documentation have been collected, all the information that the client has provided also in line with the profile, in line with what we expect such clients to do. And one last point I would say is that it all goes back to the fact that a firm should have a risk appetite statement signed up by their board or by their MDs to what type of clients they want to bring into the company. So you don't get the surprise. I'm a strong believer that if you would like to bring in clients that are in I don't know, fintech companies or casinos, of course they need to use banks as well. You can deal with any particular client long as you have good subject matter experts in your organization to understand the products, understand the nature of the client. So having a good risk appetite statement from the board, from the senior management, telling the ops that we are expecting these type of clients, these type of industries, this is how many low, medium, high risk clients we can absorb as a bank, and we will not put the ops team under undue pressure by bringing in so many clients from high risk countries, and then all of a sudden your ops network is so under pressure that they cannot cope. So having that statement and having a threshold of how many high risk clients per year you can onboard, how many high risk clients per year you can recertify, are you going to be onboarding clients from these high risk sectors, industries? Do you have the right skill set in your ops team, in your compliance function, in order to make sure that they are up to speed with the sophisticated type of risks that the organization will face?
Thank you. A lot of good advice there. I'm sure people are hanging on that, which is excellent. Really practical as well in terms of that prescriptive, almost prescriptive nature of the types of customers you might want to expect, and the risk appetite statement from the board, which is one we'll come back to in the next segment. We are moving towards, I guess, our final 10 minutes that we're in. I wanted just to return to the poll results. If we could launch push the results. I'm not sure if that's changed in the last 5 or 10 minutes, but I think it's probably, I've seen Bill break a smile there. It's probably a good one to bring Bill in just to comment on that, and then perhaps think about this idea of building a case for investment, because ultimately that's what these two things are intrinsically linked: the education around the role, the importance, and then the appetite to change that. Bill, first your reaction to that, and then maybe thinking about.
Well, I'm not surprised that there's that disconnect. And again, it comes to this siloed notion of what does a chief risk officer, chief compliance officer really know about what's going on in the engine room of those who have to actually make the risk decisions, of the shortfalls in data, of the shortfalls in the technology. I mean, that knowledge is the only way that you're going to create a return on investment to invest in a transformative type program that actually will have results, positive and negative. I mean, to Bassett's point, you can save billions depending on what type of organization and what level of fines you can get, but there's also the distraction of those regulatory actions. I mean, many times the costs are equal or greater simply in how much effort you have to put into to responding. So there has to be a business sense to a transformative activity, and that's what I meant by the upskilling, because both the leadership and the operations teams have to understand their role. That money does not grow on trees, and so they have to make the pitches, and generally that pitch for transformation is at the highest levels. Even in the largest organizations, it's going to be at the highest levels, because it's still considered, compliance is still considered to the top levels many times a cost. It's not considered something that can distinguish you in the world, in world commerce, as someone other people want to work with. there are real positives to having these things in place. So it's there's return on investment is still a critical concept. It's just going to take a whole different approach. To Tim's point, it's not, there's no book you're just going to get, because it has everything to do with what does the board care about, what does the C-suite care about, and what have they equipped the operational teams to actually do. All of that has to be aligned if you're going to actually make a dent.
So I'm going to start my stopwatch in a minute. I'm going to ask each of you in the final segment, the points around what we could do differently. I'm going to give each of you a minute, and I want you to come and have a think about your key kind of takeaway in terms of fresh mindsets to solve wicked problems, whether that's feasible in the next minute or so, we'll see. Before that, I've got a question from the panel, more of a kind of day-to-day operational question. Maybe I'll come to you, Bassett, for the question, or Bill, please jump in. It's really about the role of cyber-related due diligence, and particularly the supply chain. I mean, we've seen a big trending from listening to Anna Bradshaw earlier about sanctions becoming much more than just targeted economic measures to human rights. And I was on a panel just yesterday, the ACAMS conference, talking about the German supply chain bill, which perhaps brings in the first human rights fundamental due diligence programs, and talk of that across Europe as a regulatory initiative as well. What would that be in terms of supply chain due diligence at the moment? Perhaps, Bassett, practically in where you sit, is that a topic that crosses your desk? And again, just mindful of the time, obviously I want to get the roundup for takeaways, but is there any thoughts to that particular topic?
So on the personally on from my team standpoint, so we don't undertake any due diligence on the supply chain. So within the bank, we have a very dedicated and a specialized team to make sure that that part is covered. The I think the current events has also shown, especially if you see that you mentioned Anna's sanctions presentation. The way I look at it is that North Korea firing rockets left, right, center, one of the most toughest sanctions that you can ever think of, that actually even the North Korean people are paying the heavy price of that. Iran under very, very strong sanctions for the last almost more than 110 years. That why is it that they are still able to source the equipments that they need to, for example, Iran to enrich uranium, North Korea to still be able to fire the missiles and get all these things? They simply cannot just all be from China. So how is it that the supply chain that these sanctioned countries are using, evading sanctions? And there is a U.S. firm that our bank used to basically discuss this particular topic, and the organized criminals and sanctioned states are now interlinked. So the sanctioned states are using organized criminals to use the supply chain that they control, and the organized criminals have been given the the certain tools and certain other things that they would need to operate and do their own things. So in the to identify untoward or problematic supply chain, in particularly when big firms are dealing, the key is that there should be still very much similar situation like a client. You should still have a relationship manager, a person who very much understands the nature of the entity or the nature of the third party that you are using, to make sure that it is not just you are relying on certain documentation. Some of the organizations who have some issues with their supply chain is because they are relying on just their certificate of incorporation and certain very basic details, and not having any particular on the ground due diligence that generally you would perform on the client. So I think my answer to this would be is that do not differentiate between the supply chain, do not see them as any less risk, and in particular have some on the ground due diligence, very much like when you have the visits that where the RM they visit the client. Is a very same thing. Seeing is believing. wherever there is a risk factor, seeing is believing. Go send somebody to make sure that these people are really doing what they are saying that they are doing.
Yeah, sure. It's I think it's going to be an increased convergence from what I can hear and the comments there. We are at the top of the hour. I'm told we won't be rudely cut off, so I'll continue on. But yeah, I'd like to go back to my previous challenge to Tim and to Bill and obviously to Bassett too. But yeah, thinking about the final sort of topic was about doing things differently. Which, yeah, again, without being too existential about it, but maybe in a minute or so, each of you, I'll come to Tim first, but thinking about a takeaway from the audience, probably the things that are now running around the heads of those people that have been with us for the last hour. What might you direct them to thinking about in terms of either from your experiences or areas that you personally or through experiences of working with firms in the market might think about as different approaches that might work?
Okay, I've got a minute. So I've just made a note.
My stopwatch.
Okay, I'm on board. Let's see how we go. So I've made a note of 4 things. Each of them happens to begin with a C. So the first thing I think is courage. That's having the willingness to innovate and to take risks. I think that's been a theme throughout much of what we've talked about. The second is to challenge assumptions, to challenge conventional ways of doing things, conventional wisdom. Of course, very often it's right, but on occasions, it's simply not, and it's unhelpful. The third thing I'd say is communicate. So if you're going to take risks, and I'd hope that we will increasingly, appropriately, and in a measured way, we need to communicate with the regulator. We need to communicate with our staff, with our peer group to ensure that we are doing and acting in a way which is entirely appropriate. And finally, it's a slight change of direction, but it's something that we haven't talked about, but I think is fundamental to much of the change that we're looking to achieve, and that is culture. I know, Ted, you and I have spoken about culture before, the importance of it, a healthy culture within an organization. So I'm going to challenge you, Bassett. I'm not, it's a little bit unfair because it's maybe there isn't time for you to properly respond, but you mentioned that a technical solution may have helped prevent the problems facing BNP. And of course, those problems that led to that huge fine of $9 billion plus. And the ongoing restrictions. And yes, I agree, of course they would have, but my sense of that was, and I wasn't on the inside, so I tread carefully, but my sense of it was that was an organization where the culture allowed bad behavior and poor decisions. And so if the technology was there, perhaps there would be greater accountability and transparency. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that the right decisions were made.
Thank you,
You're
Tim.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Bassett, the right of reply. And if you could try and, Bassett, think about that maybe in a minute or so, just your key takeaways and perhaps some of those practical.
Yeah, indeed. No. I think, Tim, you're absolutely right. I think the technology would have given some early indication. And one of the, one of the reason of the fine that it was too big because it took so long to get things right. And I think the technology would have, brought something in front of you in the matter of sort of minutes. That's something that people had to look from documentation and different things. So I hope that's perhaps clear that. For me, if I do anything, differently, I think that the key is that continuous improvement, skill improvement of the ops team. These days, you cannot simply fire people, and you don't have to. I mean, you don't need to as well. If the world is changing, the bank is changing, there is transformation going on, new regulation is coming in, new systems are coming in, regulators asking every week different new things. I would do differently is that what I would do differently is to make sure that the people are selected to prepare for the future. You cannot come in every month or every day to the bank or your organization and change people just because you don't like them or this, that. I think it is to making sure that the teams that you have, whether it's in compliance or in ops team, due diligence or anything, that they are continuously improving, their skill set is improving, they are becoming subject matter expert, so that for the changing world, for the changing regulations, you are always one step ahead, rather than what often happens is that by the time you prepare yourself for something, the regulation is now changed and it's now 6 AMLD, it's now the 7th AMLD, the MiFID regulation is changed or something is changed. So to me, this is key, that spending some time within your teams, cross training within the teams often helps, and it's not that necessarily you have to always spend thousands of pounds and bring in external qualification. So there are different ways of achieving the skill improvement and skill set improvement within the team, and to me that this is something that I is any area of focus for me in particular, making sure that going forward this is what I focus.
Thanks, Bassett. It's positive. Bill,
15 seconds.
Well, I'll allow you 2 minutes.
No, I don't even need 2 minutes. I'm just, if I could change anything, it would be get nation states and organizations to focus on the fact that there's a couple of dozen crimes types that could not exist if we could cut off the ability to launder the money, because there would be no profits to be made. They wouldn't be able to utilize those hordes of cash, and thus it would become disinteresting to the criminal networks. And we know what those are, and we never had the data on at a level of significance in order to have smart technology be able to pinpoint that for a person to take action. So that's where I'd really want to get, is we're still way too high on the typical financial crime due diligence horizon as to what we're looking at. I would like to see really that background, and we're only going to get there by crunching far more information than we're crunching today, and being allowed to do it, because privacy is another concern. And I just have one comment on the, I'll steal this one, but on the cyber is the new nuke. Cyber can do far more damage to an organization or a country than any nuclear device ever could. And that's why it is critical and becoming even more critical all the time.
Thank you, Bill. I'll have to close the session down now. I'm sure we could talk for another couple of hours, and certainly opening up topics around cyber and proliferation. So, but thank you, all three of you, Tim, Bassett, Bill. Thank you for joining us on this session. Thanks for staying with us. Apologies for running slightly over, but I hope you got some good insights, and we look forward to carrying on the discussion, following up and speaking to you all very soon. Have a good evening or morning, afternoon, and take care, and we'll all speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ted.